The desert burned beneath a white sun. Heat shimmered in the horizon, bending the air into mirages. And from that mirage, a small banner rose, the golden Chris of Jerusalem, carried by 500 knights riding into legend. Their leader was 16 years old. His hands, wrapped in silk bandages, could barely hold the reins. His face was hidden behind a silver mask. Yet in that November morning in 1177, this dying boy would face the greatest army Islam had ever gathered, 26,000 warriors under the command of Saladin, the sword of faith and empire. To every witness, it seemed madness. The numbers alone defied reason, one man for every 52. Even the wind seemed to whisper surrender. But Baldwin IV, the Leper King, felt no fear. Perhaps because he could no longer feel anything at all. He raised his bandaged hand toward the blinding sky. Sunlight caught the metal Chris and his crown, scattering gold across the helmets behind him. Today, he said, we stand where history will remember. And so 500 knights charged toward 26,000, toward death, toward immortality. In that instant, the Holy Land held its breath. Sand on faith, flesh on steel, destiny on disease, all collided in one battlefield that would echo through centuries. The Battle of Montgisard was about to begin. If you believe that courage can defy reason, that a single spark can outshine an empire, stay with us. Because what happened next would change the story of faith and war forever. Before the dust of Montgisard ever rose, the Holy Land was already dying. For nearly 80 years, the Crusader kingdoms had clung to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean like a flame in the wind. They were born out of faith and fear, fortresses of stone and devotion built by men who believed God himself had sent them to hold Jerusalem. But by 1177, that faith was faltering. One by one, the great castles of Outremer had fallen. The deserts swallowed their banners. The pilgrims' roads grew empty. In the markets of Jerusalem, merchants whispered that the kingdom's glory was ending, that even God had turned his face away. The reason had a name, Saladin. To the Muslim world, he was Salar ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the warrior of unity, the scholar of faith. To his enemies, he was simply the sword of Islam. At 40 years old, he had achieved what centuries of sultans could knit, uniting Egypt and Syria under a single banner. His armies stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. His reputation rode before him like a sandstorm. Cities surrendered at the sight of his standard. Facing him was a kingdom ruled by a boy. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, crowned at 13, was already dying. Leprosy, the medieval curse, had claimed his nerves, his skin, his strength. What it could not touch was his mind. The disease that ribbed him of touch sharpened his will like tempered steel. He studied maps, memorized terrain, and learned to see what others overlooked. His courtiers whispered he was cursed. His enemies said his illness was proof of divine punishment. But those who met him spoke of a strange light in his eyes, a calm that unnerved even seasoned generals. In an age of superstition, he was a living paradox, a dying child who ruled men, a broken biddy that commanded belief. Across the deserts of Palestine, rumors spread that Saladin was gathering a force unlike any seen since the First Crusade. 26,000 mounted warriors, 8,000 of them elite Mamluks, soldiers raised from childhood to fight, to kill, to never retreat. His purpose was clear, the annihilation of the Christian kingdoms once and for all. Inside Jerusalem's walls, despair took root. Nobles sent their families to the coast. Ships waited in silence at Jaffa's harbor. Even the priests prayed in whispers. Baldwin's advisors begged him to stay behind the city's gates, to survive, if only as a symbol. But Baldwin understood what symbols were worth when faith was failing, nothing. He called a war council. Too weak to stand, he was carried in a litter. His voice, though faint, cut through the hall like a blade. If Jerusalem falls while I live, he said, then I have lived for nothing. The boy king's words silenced the room. Every man they knew what he was facing, 26,000 against barely 500 knights on 3,000 infantry. Yet when Baldwin spoke of marching to meet Saladin in open ground, no. One dared call him mad. Perhaps it was the sight of him, his silver mask gleaming under torchlight, his bandaged hands trembling yet steady in the armrest. Or perhaps it was the tone of quiet inevitability in his voice, as if he were already speaking from beyond pain, beyond fear. Some men lead through strength. Baldwin led through faith, not the faith of miracles, but of will. In the last days before Montgisard, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had no advantage of numbers, no promise of survival. Only a boy king who refused to surrender. On foe to the south, beneath banners of green and gold, Saladin's army began to move, 26,000 horsemen, their armor flashing like a sea of mirrors under the desert sun. The storm was coming. November 1177. The sky over Jerusalem was a sheet of pale gold. The desert wind carried whispers of fear. Saladin's banners had crossed into the kingdom, and every scout brought darker news. Villages burned. Fortresses surrendered. The horizon itself seemed to move, a tide of dust raised by 26,000 hooves. In the royal citadel, Baldwin IV received the reports in silence. His hands trembled as he reached for a map spread across the table. The parchment rustled like dry leaves. Around him, his council urged retreat. "Let the walls defend what your booty can't," they pleaded. But the Leper King shook his head. "If I hide, Jerusalem falls before the battle even begins." At dawn, the gates of Jerusalem opened. The city watched in stunned disbelief as its dying Menach rode out at the head of his knights. His booty was strapped to the saddle. His legs could no longer hold him upright. The silver mask glinted in the morning light, transforming him into something almost otherworldly, a figure half man, half myth. Behind him rode the Knights Templar, 80 warrior monks, sworn never to retreat, the black on white banners snapping in the wind. Alongside them, 400 secular knights on a few thousand-foot soldiers, farmers, tradesmen, pilgrims who'd never seen war. They marched toward a horizon filled with death. The journey to Montgisard was agony. 45 miles in 36 hours, through heat and dust. Baldwin drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind flickering between prayer and delirium. When his hands could no longer hold the reins, Templars guided his horse. When pain overwhelmed him, they carried him in a litter. Yet he refused to stop. Every step, he whispered, is one closer to Gid, or to the end. By the second day, exhaustion hung over the column like a fog. Armor weighed like stone. Horses stumbled, lips foaming. But then came the message that cut through despair like lightning: Saladin's army was near, and unprepared. The scouts returned breathless. The enemy was scattered across the plains near Montgisard, spread wide for foraging, their discipline relaxed. Saladin believed Baldwin trapped behind Jerusalem's walls. He had left his rear exposed. The realization struck Baldwin's commanders with both hope and dread. Yes, the Sultan's army was vulnerable, but still vast, 26,000 strong. Attacking meant suicide. Waiting meant annihilation. In that moment of doubt, Baldwin's voice, hoarse and cracked, broke the silence. David faced Goliath with faith, he said. We faced 26,000 with Gid. The Templar Grand Master Odo Ducent. Amand lowered his head, then let us be his hammer. That night, the Crusaders camped in eerie silence. The moon hung like a blade above the dunes. Men whispered prayers. Some wrote hurried letters to families they would never see again. Baldwin sat apart, wrapped in a cloak against the cold. His physician begged him to rest. Instead, the young king stared into the desert, listening to the faint tremor of distant hooves. They think we are ghosts, he murmured. Tomorrow, we show them they are right. At dawn on November 25th, the desert was unnaturally still. A thin mist clung to the sand, softening the edges of the world. From a rise overlooking the plain, Baldwin and his knights saw the impossible, Saladin's vast encampment, its tents scattered, guards half asleep, horses untethered. The Leper King turned to his men. You see their numbers. I see their weakness. The sun rose, slow and merciless, casting the battlefield in gold. Beneath that light, fear and faith became indistinguishable. The knights adjusted their armor, tightened their grips in the lances. Some kissed their cresses, others clenched their teeth. Baldwin raised his bandaged hand. The gesture trembled, yet the meaning was unmistakable. When I lure it, he said, ride as if the world ends today. The Templar horn sounded, a single, piercing note that rolled across the plains like thunder. 500 knights began to move, hooves striking the earth in unison, a rhythm of fate. From the dunes beyond, Saladin's army stirred. Prepared. The Leper King whispered the final words only his squire could hear. May history bear witness. The charge had begun. The sun stood high over the plain of Montgisard. Heat rippled across the desert, turning armor into mirrors and men into silhouettes. Saladin's army stretched for miles, a living ocean of steel on silk. Drums echoed from the camps. Camels groaned beneath the weight of supplies. The Sultan himself watched from a small rise, unaware that death was already galloping toward him. To the north, Baldwin's 500 knights formed a single line along the ridge. Dust swirled around them, cloaking their numbers. The banners, the crimson kriss of the Templars, the golden crest of Jerusalem, snapped in the wind. The Leper King sat motionless in his saddle, a statue of silver unsuffering. His hands were bound to the reins, his legs strapped to the horse. Only his eyes moved, cold and bright behind the mask. At 2 in the afternoon, a horn sounded once, ling on low. The line of knights began to descend the slope. First at a walk, then a trot, then a gallop. Within seconds, 500 became a storm. From Saladin's vantage, the dust cloud looked small, insignificant. His emirs laughed. A scouting party, they said. They send children to die. But as the seconds passed, the thunder of hooves grew louder. The laughter faded. Then came the words no general wants to hear, they are charging. Saladin turned, disbelieving. 500 men against 26,000, madness. But by the time he shouted for his lines to form, it was too late. His army was still scattered across the fields, men fetching water, tending horses, praying, resting. 3 miles separated his vanguard from his rear, and Baldwin was coming fast. The charge tore across the desert like a blade. Arrows began to fall, thin, dark rain. Horses stumbled. Knights fell. Yet the line held. The Templars at the front lowered their lances, forming a wedge of unsteppable momentum. They shouted one phrase, again and again, Des Vault, good wills it. At 200 yards, the first ranks of Muslim cavalry formed, a wall of shields and spears. But panic rippled through their horses. The sound, the speed, the sheer audacity of the attack shattered the discipline. Animals reared, riders shouted, the wall fractured. Then came the impact. It was not a clash, it was an explosion. Wood splintered, steel screamed. The Templar wedge punched through Saladin's center like an iron spear, scattering Mamluks and guardsmen alike. Men vanished beneath hooves. Spears broke, lances snapped. Swords rose and fell in flashes of silver. Saladin's banner dipped as his bodyguard reeled. The Sultan dripped his golden mace, stunned by what he saw. 500 knights tearing through the heart of his army as if possessed. He shouted for his men to reform, but his voice was drowned by case. Behind the Templars came the second wave, Baldwin's remaining knights, bloodied and roaring. Their horses, half dead from exhaustion, fought like beasts from another world. Baldwin rode among them, bound to his saddle, sword raised high. His bandaged hand trembled, but his gaze never wavered. He was no longer the sick boy of Jerusalem. He was the embodiment of every desperate prayer rooted within its walls. For 2 hours, the desert became a furnace of screams on steel. The Crusaders cut through Saladin's center again and again, widening the breach. The Sultan's left wing faltered, then broke. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Soldiers threw down weapons. Camels bolted. The sky filled with dust and terror. Baldwin's infantry, hidden behind low ridges, now rose and struck the Muslim flank. To Saladin's men, it seemed new armies had materialized from the sand itself. "We are surrounded," they cried. The belief became truth. At 3 o'clock, the battle turned from case to rout. Saladin's right wing collapsed entirely. His personal guard, 2,000 elite Mamluks, tried to hold the line. For a moment, they stemmed the tide. Then Baldwin gave the order that sealed their fate. He pointed his sword toward the center and whispered forward. The Templars obeyed without hesitation. 12 knights under Grand Master Odo Descent. Amun charged into a formation of 500 Mamluks. The collision shattered the line. When asked later how 12 could break 500, Odo replied, "They feared Gid's wrath. We embodied it." Saladin watched in disbelief as his army, an army that had conquered Egypt and Syria, disintegrated. He shouted for his standard-bearers to rally the troops. None answered. The ravines that cut through the plain became traps, swallowing men and horses alike. Warriors trampled one another in blind panic. Realizing the battle was lost, Saladin made a fateful choice. He abandoned his warhorse, mounted a swift camel, and fled. The sight of their sultan escaping broke what remained of morale. The mighty army of Islam dissolved into a flood of terrified men. By 4 o'clock, Montgisard was no longer a battlefield but a graveyard. The Crusaders, drunk in victory and disbelief, pursued for miles. Lances shattered, swords bent, When weapons failed, they fought with fists, maces, even helmets. The sand turned red beneath the hooves. No one truly knows how many died that afternoon. Muslim chroniclers claimed 20,000. Others said more. What is certain is that only a few thousand survived to see sunset. Baldwin's armor was dented, his robes soaked in blood, his own and others. Beneath his mask, tears mingled with sweat. Some said they were tears of pain. Others said they were tears of awe. When his physicians tried to lift him from the saddle, he refused. "Not yet," he whispered. As the sun sank behind the hills, the battlefield glowed crimson. Baldwin ordered his knights to kneel among the biddies. Together they prayed the words that would echo across centuries: Nin nibis, Dumin, Nin nibis, sed nemini toward a gloriam. Net to us, Lord, net to us, but to your name give glory. The Leper King had done the impossible. When the dust finally settled over Montgisard, silence reclaimed the desert. Where Saladin's banners had once rippled like a sea, only corpses remained, tens of thousands of them. The ravines that had swallowed his army now ran thick with the weight of the fallen. The air itself carried the metallic scent of history. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, was lifted from his saddle at last. His body was broken beyond repair, his hands bleeding through the silk wrappings. Yet as his knights surrounded him, expecting death, he smiled behind the silver mask. "Pain," he whispered, "is the price of service." In that moment, even his enemies took note. Muslim chroniclers wrote of the day as divine punishment proof. They said, "That arrogance defies heaven." Christian monks called it a miracle. Historians, centuries later, would call it something else: leadership against the impossible. For Saladin, Montgisard was more than defeat. It was humiliation. The invincible sultan fled with barely 2,000 survivors. The legend of his invincibility, built over decades, shattered in one afternoon. It would take him 10 years to rebuild his strength, and 10 years to erase the fear that a dying boy had coved into his name. But even victories fade. Baldwin's own body would soon betray him completely. Blind, crippled, eaten alive by his disease, he ruled 8 more years, each a defiance of mortality. When he finally died at 24, Saladin himself is said to have whispered, "I feared that man more than any army." The sands of Montgisard hold no monuments. The wind has erased the tracks of kings and soldiers alike. Yet the lesson remains: courage needs no health, no fortune, no numbers. Only faith, in something greater than fear. History is not made by numbers, nor by the strong, but by those who refuse to yield when reason says they should. The sands of Montgisard have long since cooled, yet the echo of that impossible charge still rides the wind. If stories of courage, conviction, and the will to defy the impossible move you, stay with us. Because beyond every battle and every king lies something greater, the timeless question of what it means to be human. Subscribe and journey with us through the echoes of history.